Maxwell Carter sat in the shadowy silence of his vast Detroit mansion, a glass of whiskey trembling in his frail hands. Once a symbol of power and prestige, the estate now felt more like a gilded prison. Outside, the Michigan winter howled, the wind rattling the glass panes of his floor-to-ceiling windows. The frost creeping along the edges mirrored the chill that had settled in his heart. Maxwell had always been a man who thrived on control of his business, his wealth, and as much as he could his family. But now, at the age of 65, the control was gone. The diagnosis had come swiftly and mercilessly. An aggressive, terminal cancer had spread through his body, leaving him with only weeks to live. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the ache that had hollowed out his soul. Mark, his only son, was gone. 3 months ago, they'd had a fight so explosive that it shattered the last fragile threads of their relationship. Maxwell could still hear the echo of Mark's angry voice reverberating in his head. "You don't care about anyone but yourself. I'm done with you." Mark had walked out that day and hadn't looked back. No calls, no texts, just an empty void where his son's presence used to be. Maxwell had thought about reaching out, swallowing his pride, but something always held him back. Maybe it was his stubbornness. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was a sinking realization that Mark was right. Maxwell's gaze drifted to the enormous portrait hanging above the fireplace. It was a picture-perfect moment frozen in time. A young Mark, barely 8 years old, clutching a red kite, smiling up at his parents. Maxwell stood tall behind him, the very image of success. His late wife, Eleanor, radiated warmth as she knelt beside Mark, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Maxwell's chest tightened as he stared at that image. Back then, he'd thought he had it all: money, power, and the love of a family. But even then, the cracks had been forming. The long hours at the office, the missed birthdays, the hollow promises to make it up to them later. Eleanor had always tried to bridge the gap, but after her sudden passing 5 years ago, everything fell apart. Maxwell threw himself into his work, thinking it would somehow fix the gaping hole left in their lives. Instead, it only widened the chasm between him and Mark. Now, as the clock ticked relentlessly toward his final days, Maxwell was left with nothing but memories and regrets. His body, once strong and commanding, was a shadow of its former self. His company, once his life's work, no longer brought him joy. And his mansion, filled with treasures from all over the world, felt hollow and cold. The shrill ring of the doorbell jolted Maxwell from his thoughts. It was the first sound of life in weeks. He furrowed his brow, the whiskey sloshing in his glass as he struggled to push himself out of the chair. Slowly, he shuffled toward the door, his breath labored, his heart pounding. Not from the exertion, but from the flicker of hope. Could it be Mark? Had he come back? Maxwell hesitated, his hand hovering over the brass doorknob. For the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. He felt fear. What if it wasn't Mark? What if it was someone bringing bad news? Or worse, what if it was Mark, but not for the reason Maxwell so desperately wanted? Taking a deep breath, he opened the door. What he saw on the other side left him speechless. Maxwell stood frozen at the door, the winter chill seeping into his bones as his mind raced back to the moments that had defined his relationship with Mark. The face that used to greet him with wide, boyish smiles was now absent. How had they ended up here, with silence and distance replacing love and connection? As Maxwell stared at the emptiness outside, memories began to flood his mind, each one sharper than the last. Mark had been a bright, curious boy, always eager for his father's attention. Maxwell remembered the way Mark used to wait at the top of the stairs when he came home late from work, clutching a drawing he'd made or a story he'd written at school. "Dad, look what I did today," Mark would say, his voice filled with excitement. But more often than not, Maxwell was too preoccupied with business calls or emails to give more than a cursory glance and a distracted "that's great, buddy." Eleanor, Maxwell's wife, had often tried to make up for his absence. She was the glue that held their small family together, making sure Mark knew he was loved even when Maxwell's priorities lay elsewhere. She would gently remind Maxwell to take breaks, to be there for the little things, but her words rarely stuck. "I'm doing this for us," Maxwell would argue. For Mark's future, it was true in part. He wanted Mark to have everything he never had growing up, a life free from financial struggles. But he failed to see the price Mark was paying for his absence. Things only got worse as Mark grew older. The bright-eyed boy became a teenager filled with resentment. Maxwell could see it in the way Mark avoided him, the way his answers grew shorter and his gaze colder. By the time Mark was in high school, their conversations had turned into shouting matches. Mark accused Maxwell of caring more about his company than his family, while Maxwell accused Mark of being ungrateful for the opportunities his wealth provided. The breaking point came shortly after Eleanor's death. Her sudden passing had left both father and son reeling, but instead of leaning on each other, they retreated into their own grief. Maxwell buried himself even deeper into work, believing that staying busy would numb the pain. Mark, on the other hand, sought solace elsewhere, spending more and more time with friends and less time at home. The final argument had been brutal. It was just a few months ago, but the words still echoed in Maxwell's mind as if it had happened yesterday. "You don't even know me, Dad," Mark had shouted, his face flushed with anger. "You've spent my entire life treating me like an afterthought, and now you expect me to stick around and watch you die? I can't do this anymore." Maxwell had snapped back, his own guilt and fear masked by anger. "I gave you everything. A roof over your head, the best schools, anything you ever wanted. What more could you possibly want from me?" "Time," Mark had said, his voice breaking. "I wanted you, but it's too late for that now." And then he was gone. Maxwell had tried to tell himself that Mark just needed time, that he'd come back eventually. But as the weeks stretched into months, that hope began to wither. Now, standing at the door of his empty mansion, Maxwell realized just how deeply he had failed his son. He had given Mark everything except the one thing that truly mattered. The sound of a car passing on the street snapped Maxwell out of his reverie. He closed the door and shuffled back to his chair, his mind weighed down by the memories. He stared at the untouched whiskey in his glass, his reflection shimmering in the amber liquid. For the first time in his life, Maxwell felt truly powerless. What would he say to Mark if he ever came back? Could the wounds they had inflicted on each other ever be healed? Or was the chasm between them too wide to bridge? Maxwell leaned back in his chair, the weight of his regrets pressing down on him. Outside, the winter wind howled, carrying with it the echoes of all the things he wished he had said. The days after Mark's departure had been an unbearable blur for Maxwell. At first, he convinced himself it was temporary, that his son was simply taking time to cool off. But as the weeks turned into months, the absence became undeniable, cutting deeper than any business loss or personal failure he had ever faced. Maxwell's health had started to deteriorate shortly after Mark left, though he dismissed it as stress. The fatigue, the persistent cough, the sharp pangs in his chest. He ignored it all. He was Maxwell Carter, a man who had conquered the business world with sheer willpower. Illness, like failure, wasn't something he allowed himself to consider. But when the doctor uttered the words, "stage 4 cancer," Maxwell felt his carefully constructed world collapse. The drive home from the clinic was a haze. His chauffeur had asked if he wanted to stop anywhere, perhaps for fresh air, but Maxwell waved him off. "Just take me home," he muttered. Home! The word felt hollow now. The mansion he had once been so proud of now loomed over him like a mausoleum, filled with echoes of a life that felt distant and foreign. The first few days after the diagnosis were spent in a fog of denial. Maxwell buried himself in work, refusing to acknowledge the gravity of his situation. But it wasn't long before the symptoms began to chip away at his ability to function. Board meetings turned into phone calls, then into canceled appointments. His once commanding voice grew weaker, and the staff at his company started whispering behind closed doors. Maxwell could feel the empire he had built slipping through his fingers, but what terrified him more was the thought of dying alone. He tried to reach out to Mark once, sitting in his study with his phone in hand. The number was still saved, but Maxwell hesitated. What would he even say? How could he begin to apologize for a lifetime of neglect in a single phone call? The longer he stared at the screen, the heavier the weight in his chest grew. Eventually, he set the phone down, the call never made. It was during one of his darkest nights that the realization struck him. All his wealth, all his accomplishments, meant nothing if there was no one to share it with. Maxwell had spent decades chasing success, believing it would bring him happiness. But now, at the end of his life, he saw it for what it was, a mirage. The final blow came one evening when he decided to attend a charity gala he had helped fund. He thought it might distract him, perhaps even provide a chance to reconnect with old friends. Instead, it was a painful reminder of how disconnected he had become. People greeted him with polite smiles, their eyes filled with pity. Whispers followed him wherever he went, each one a dagger to his pride. "Isn't that Maxwell Carter? I heard he's sick. Did you know his son left him? I can't imagine." Tragic, really. All that money and no one by his side. Maxwell left the event early, his heart heavier than ever. The car ride back to the mansion was silent, the city lights flashing past like ghosts. When he arrived home, he collapsed into his chair and stared at the empty house around him. The grandeur that once symbolized his success now felt suffocating, each room a reminder of his isolation. That night, Maxwell made a decision. He wouldn't let the end of his life be defined by regret. He might not have much time left, but he would use it to try to make things right. Whether Mark would ever forgive him, Maxwell didn't know. But he had to try. As he sat in the quiet of his study, Maxwell picked up his phone again. This time he didn't hesitate. His fingers trembled as he typed out a message. "Mark, it's Dad. I need to talk to you. Please." He hit send and waited, staring at the screen as if willing it to light up with a reply. Minutes turned into hours, and still, there was nothing. Maxwell placed the phone on the desk and leaned back, the weight of his choice settling over him. It was a start, he told himself. Whether Mark responded or not, he had taken the first step. For the first time in months, Maxwell allowed himself a flicker of hope. The days following Maxwell's message to Mark felt agonizingly slow. He carried his phone everywhere, checking it obsessively for any sign of a response. Each time the screen remained blank, the ache in his chest deepened. Despite the silence, Maxwell clung to the hope that his son might still care enough to reply. It was all he had left. One evening, as Maxwell sat by the window of his study, the city of Detroit sprawled out before him. His mind wandered to the few moments of connection he and Mark had shared over the years. He remembered teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway, the way Mark had laughed after falling, and getting back up with determination. That stubbornness, so much like his own, had always been one of Mark's defining traits. Maxwell had admired it once, but over time, it became a source of friction between them. The sudden chime of the doorbell jolted him from his thoughts. Maxwell furrowed his brow. He wasn't expecting anyone. Visitors had grown scarce since his diagnosis became public knowledge. Most people didn't know how to face him now, unsure of what to say to a man whose days were numbered. Gripping the arm of his chair, Maxwell pushed himself to his feet and shuffled toward the door. His once powerful stride had been reduced to a labored shuffle, a painful reminder of how far he'd fallen. When he opened the door, he was met with an unexpected sight. A young woman stood there, her arms wrapped tightly around herself to block the cold. She looked to be in her early 20s, with strikingly familiar blue eyes and a hesitant smile that wavered as she spoke. "Mr. Carter?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Yes," Maxwell replied, his voice hoarse. "And you are?" "I'm Emily," she said, her gaze dropping briefly. "Mark's fiancée." The words hit Maxwell like a thunderclap. He blinked, trying to process what she had just said. "Mark's fiancée?" Emily nodded, biting her lip as she seemed to search for the right words. "I know this is unexpected, and I wasn't sure if I should come, but I didn't know where else to go. Mark doesn't know I'm here." Maxwell stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. As she entered the house, her eyes widened at the sheer size of the mansion, but there was no admiration in her expression, only quiet observation. She followed Maxwell into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, clutching her coat tightly around her. "I don't understand," Maxwell said, lowering himself into a chair across from her. "Why are you here? Where is Mark?" Emily hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. "Mark doesn't know I'm here because we've been distant lately. After the fight you two had, he changed. He's been shutting people out, even me. But I can see how much it's eating away at him. He misses you, Mr. Carter. He's just too proud or maybe too scared to say it." Maxwell felt a lump form in his throat. "If he misses me, why hasn't he reached out?" "I've been waiting." He stopped himself, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. Emily's expression softened. "I think he's afraid of being hurt again. He's carried a lot of pain from your relationship. But I came here because I think you both need each other more than ever right now. I wanted to see if there was a way to help you reconnect before it's too late." Her words cut through Maxwell like a knife. For so long, he had convinced himself that Mark's absence was a form of punishment, a final rejection. But hearing Emily speak, he realized that perhaps his son's silence was rooted in something deeper, something they both needed to face. "Does he know about my diagnosis?" Maxwell asked quietly. Emily shook her head. "No, I wanted to tell him, but I thought it should come from you." Maxwell leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The idea of facing Mark again filled him with both hope and dread. What if Mark didn't want to hear from him? What if it was too late to repair the damage? "I'll try," Maxwell said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if he'll listen, but I'll try." Emily nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "That's all anyone can do." As she stood to leave, Maxwell felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in months: determination. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he might have a chance to make things right. The morning after Emily's visit, Maxwell woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. His body was weak, his breath shallow, but his mind was sharper than it had been in months. He couldn't let another day pass without trying to reach Mark. Maxwell stared at his phone for a long time before dialing Mark's number. His hands trembled as he held the device to his ear, each ring echoing louder in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the call went to voicemail. Maxwell closed his eyes, gathering the courage to leave a message. "Mark, it's Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to see you. Please. I don't have much time left, and there's so much I need to say. Just think about it." He hung up and sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. Maxwell wasn't sure what he expected, but the silence that followed was crushing. Hours turned into days, and the hope that Mark would respond began to wane. Then, one evening, as Maxwell sat by the fire with a cup of tea, his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a text from an unknown number. "This is Mark. What do you want?" Maxwell stared at the message, his heart racing. He quickly typed back, "I want to see you. Please. It's important." There was a long pause before the next reply came. "Where?" A wave of relief washed over Maxwell. He gave Mark his address, and they agreed to meet the next day. As soon as the conversation ended, Maxwell felt a mix of anticipation and dread. What would he say? How would Mark react? The years of pain and anger between them couldn't be erased with a single conversation, but Maxwell knew he had to try. The next day, Maxwell prepared as best he could. He dressed in his finest suit, though it hung loosely on his frail frame, and sat in the living room waiting. Every creak of the old house made his heart leap, but it wasn't until late afternoon that he finally heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Maxwell stood, using the arm of the couch for support as the doorbell rang. He opened it to find Mark standing there, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Mark looked older than Maxwell remembered, the boyish features replaced by a hardened expression. His eyes, so much like his mother's, were guarded, as if he were bracing for a fight. "Mark," Maxwell said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded but said nothing, stepping inside and looking around the grand home he had once called his own. The silence between them was heavy as they made their way to the living room. Maxwell gestured for Mark to sit, but his son remained standing, his posture stiff. "What's so important that you couldn't just text me?" Mark asked, his tone clipped. Maxwell took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I wanted to tell you in person. I'm sick, Mark. Cancer, stage 4. Mark's expression didn't change, but Maxwell saw the faintest flicker of emotion in his eyes. Shock, maybe even fear. "And what do you want from me?" Mark asked after a long pause. "Forgiveness? Sympathy? I want a chance," Maxwell said, his voice breaking. "A chance to make things right. I know I've failed you, Mark. I've failed in ways I can't even begin to explain, but I don't want to leave this world without trying to fix what I broke." Mark looked away, his jaw tightening. "You think saying you're sorry will erase everything? All the times you weren't there? All the years I spent wondering if you even cared?" "No," Maxwell admitted. "I know it won't, but I have to try. You're my son, Mark. I love you, even if I didn't show it the way I should have." The words hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Maxwell felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he never had before. Mark shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, his voice barely audible. "Just stay," Maxwell said. "For an hour. That's all I'm asking. Let me tell you everything I never said. And then, if you still want to leave, I won't stop you." Mark hesitated, the conflict evident in his eyes. Finally, he sighed and sat down on the edge of the couch, his posture tense. "An hour," he said. "That's all." Maxwell nodded, a small smile breaking through the pain. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The room was thick with unspoken words as Maxwell and Mark sat opposite each other. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crackle of the fire in the hearth was the only sound, filling the silence that felt both comforting and suffocating. Maxwell knew this might be his only chance to confront the chasm between them, but finding the right words felt impossible. Mark broke the silence first. "So, what do you want to say, Dad? This is your big moment, right? Explain to me why you disappeared every time I needed you." The bitterness in his son's voice was sharp, but Maxwell couldn't blame him. He looked down at his hands, frail and trembling, and took a deep breath. "Mark, I don't know where to begin. I don't have excuses, but I want to give you the truth, even if it's ugly." Mark leaned back, crossing his arms. "Go ahead. I'm listening." Maxwell hesitated before speaking. "When your mother and I got married, I thought I could balance everything, my ambition, my family, my dreams. But I was wrong. Work consumed me. Every deal, every project felt like a step closer to the life I thought we deserved. And in chasing that, I lost sight of what really mattered. Mark's gaze didn't waver, but his expression softened slightly. Maxwell continued, his voice raw. I wasn't there when you needed me because I convinced myself that providing was enough. That as long as you had a roof over your head and opportunities, you'd be fine. But I was wrong. I should have been at your soccer games, your school plays, your graduations. I should have been your dad, not just a provider. Mark's jaw tightened. You think saying all this now changes anything? You missed everything, Dad. Mom did all the work. She picked up the pieces every time you let us down. Maxwell nodded, tears welling in his eyes. She was incredible. I took her for granted, just like I did with you. When she got sick, His voice broke and he paused, struggling to compose himself. I didn't know how to handle it. I buried myself in work because I couldn't face losing her. And when she died, I thought I'd lost my chance to be a good father to you, too. Mark's eyes glistened, though he refused to let the tears fall. You didn't just lose your chance, you gave it up. You chose your work over us every time. I know, Maxwell said, his voice barely above a whisper, and I've regretted it every day since. But regret doesn't change the past. All I can do is ask for your forgiveness and try to make the time I have left mean something. Mark shook his head, standing abruptly. You don't just get to ask for forgiveness and expect everything to be okay. You can't undo years of pain with a single conversation. Maxwell looked up at his son, his own tears streaming freely now. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I love you, Mark. I always have. I was just too blind, too selfish, to show it the way I should have. Mark turned away, his shoulders tense. For a moment, Maxwell thought he would leave, that this fragile bridge they were building would collapse. But then Mark spoke, his voice low and trembling. You don't get it, do you? I wanted your time, your attention, your approval, not your money. I wanted you to see me, to be proud of me. But all you cared about was your company. Maxwell stood slowly, his frail body protesting with every movement. I see you now, Mark, and I am proud of you. Not because of your achievements, but because you're strong, compassionate, and so much better than I ever was. Mark turned back, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. Why couldn't you say that before? Why does it take you dying for you to see me? Maxwell's voice broke. Because I was a coward, and I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but it's all I have left. The room fell silent again, the weight of their shared pain pressing down on both of them. Finally, Mark sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said quietly. You don't have to, Maxwell replied. I just needed you to know the truth. Whatever you decide after this, I'll accept it. Mark didn't respond, and for a while, they sat in silence. Maxwell didn't push him for more. He simply sat with a fragile hope that this moment, painful as it was, could be the start of something new. The days following their conversation were quiet. Mark didn't stay long that first evening, leaving abruptly after their emotional exchange. Maxwell didn't try to stop him. He knew better than to push too hard. But something had shifted. Mark hadn't walked away permanently. He was thinking, processing, and that alone gave Maxwell a sliver of hope. Maxwell spent those days reflecting, sifting through old photo albums and letters, reliving memories that were equal parts joyful and painful. As he sat in his study one afternoon, surrounded by remnants of the life he'd built and the family he'd neglected, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. Can we talk? I have questions. Maxwell's heart raced as he typed back. Of course. Anytime. They agreed to meet that evening. Maxwell prepared himself as best as he could, not knowing what questions Mark would bring, or whether he had the strength to answer them. When Mark arrived, his demeanor was different. He wasn't as guarded as before, though a hint of skepticism lingered in his eyes. He carried a small box under his arm, which he set on the coffee table as he sat down. "What's that?" Maxwell asked, nodding toward the box. Mark hesitated before answering. "It's Mom's. I found it while going through her things." Maxwell's breath hitched. He hadn't seen that box in years, but he recognized it instantly. It was one of Lila's most treasured possessions, a place where she kept mementos and letters, pieces of their life together. Mark opened the box and pulled out a stack of old envelopes, their edges worn with time. "I found these," he said, handing them to Maxwell. "They're letters she wrote to you." Maxwell's hands trembled as he took the letters. He opened the first one, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Maxwell, I wish you were here tonight. Mark had his first school play, and he was incredible. He kept looking into the audience, searching for you. When he realized you weren't there, he tried to hide it, but I saw the disappointment in his eyes. I know you're working hard for us, but he needs you, Maxwell. We both do." Maxwell stopped reading, his vision blurred by tears. He set the letter down, unable to continue. Mark watched him closely. "She wrote dozens of these, Dad, letters she never sent. I think she wanted to tell you how she felt, but she didn't know how, or maybe she thought you wouldn't listen." Maxwell swallowed hard, the weight of Lila's words pressing down on him. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't realize how much she was carrying on her own." Mark leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "That's the thing, Dad. You didn't know because you didn't look. You didn't ask. And now it's too late for her to tell you herself." Maxwell nodded, guilt tightening like a vice around his chest. "You're right. I failed her, just like I failed you, and I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life." Mark stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into the box again and pulled out a smaller envelope. "There's one more thing. This one's addressed to me." Maxwell's eyes widened. "What does it say?" Mark hesitated before opening the envelope. He unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. "My dearest Mark, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I want you to know how proud I am of the man you've become. You've always had a kind heart, even when life wasn't kind to you. I know you carried pain from your relationship with your father, but I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive him, not for his sake, but for yours. Holding on to anger will only weigh you down, my love. Let it go and let yourself heal." Mark's voice faltered, and he stopped reading. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. The room was silent for a long moment before Mark spoke again. "She always believed in you, even when I didn't. She thought you could change." Maxwell's throat tightened. "I wish I could tell her she was right, that I'm trying, even if it's too late to make it up to her." Mark looked at him, his expression softer than it had been in years. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you, Dad, but maybe we can try to figure this out together." A fragile smile broke across Maxwell's face. "I'd like that, Mark, more than anything." For the first time in years, there was a sense of possibility between them. It wasn't resolution, but it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Maxwell or Mark had ever experienced together. Slowly, awkwardly at times, they began to navigate the fragile terrain of rebuilding their relationship. Mark visited more frequently, helping Maxwell sort through old belongings, tackling minor household repairs, and even joining him for meals, a stark contrast to the years of silence between them. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Maxwell handed Mark a thick envelope. Mark frowned, looking at it with suspicion. "What's this?" "Something I've been working on," Maxwell said, his voice steady but somber. "It's my will, and more than that, a blueprint for what I want to leave behind." Mark's eyebrows furrowed as he opened the envelope, pulling out several pages of neatly typed documents. Maxwell continued as Mark skimmed through the contents. "I've set up a foundation, Mark, a way to use what I built to help people who were like us, struggling to find their way, looking for a second chance." Mark looked up, his expression unreadable. "You're giving it all away?" Maxwell nodded. "Most of it. The foundation will focus on education, mental health, and family support programs. I want to do something meaningful with the time I have left, something that matters." Mark leaned back, processing his father's words. "That's unexpected. But why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want you to be part of it," Maxwell said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "You're the future, Mark. This isn't just about making amends. It's about creating a legacy that reflects the lessons I've learned too late." "I can't do it without you." Mark hesitated, the weight of the request settling over him. "You think I'm ready for something like this? I'm not sure I even know how to." "You are," Maxwell interrupted. "I've seen it in you. You're compassionate, driven, and you understand what it means to struggle. You will bring heart to this work, something I've lacked for most of my life." Mark's throat tightened, emotion welling up in a way he hadn't expected. "You really believe that?" Maxwell's eyes softened. "With all my heart. But it's your choice, Mark. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Mark sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the papers in his hands. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but quiet. "If I do this, it's not for you. It's for Mom, for the people who need help." Maxwell smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and sadness in his expression. "That's all I could ever hope for." As the foundation took shape, Maxwell poured his remaining energy into the project. He worked closely with lawyers, social workers, and community leaders, crafting a vision that reflected his newfound understanding of what truly mattered. Mark, despite his initial reluctance, became deeply involved, bringing fresh ideas and a personal touch to the initiative. In the final days of Maxwell's life, he found peace in a way he never thought possible. The foundation was officially launched, its mission clear: to support families in crisis, provide opportunities for education, and create safe spaces for mental health support. One afternoon, as Maxwell rested in his favorite chair, Mark sat beside him. They shared a quiet moment, the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. "Dad," Mark said softly, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about what Mom wrote in her letter to me, about forgiveness." Maxwell turned to him, his eyes tired but attentive. "And—" Mark took a deep breath. "I don't know if I'll ever fully let go of the anger, but I do forgive you for trying, for owning up to your mistakes, for showing me that people can change, even when it's hard." Maxwell's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mark. That means more to me than you'll ever know." The room fell quiet again, but this time, the silence was filled with understanding rather than tension. Maxwell reached for Mark's hand, and for the first time in years, they shared a moment of genuine connection. A month later, Maxwell passed away peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, Mark stood before a crowd of family, friends, and beneficiaries of the foundation. His voice was steady as he spoke. "My father wasn't perfect. He made mistakes that hurt the people he loved the most. But in the end, he showed me that it's never too late to try, to make amends, to change, to leave the world better than you found it. The foundation we built together is his legacy, but it's also a testament to the power of redemption. I'm proud to carry that forward in his honor." As Mark stepped down from the podium, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. His father's journey had ended, but their shared mission was just beginning. And in that, Maxwell's life had found its true meaning.